Hey everyone, welcome to Aurelia's Virtual Book Club. We are discussing The Deadlands by Dylan J. Morgan today. Um, I hope you all had a chance to read it because there might be spoilers. So if you don't want the ending given away, pause and come back and listen later. Um, I thought it was an interesting book. It's not it's not a book I would typically pick off the shelf and read. It's a little more thriller-like than usual. But I had fun reading it, so I'm glad I read it. Um, I thought it was really interesting how he was sort of exploring the ramifications and repercussions of a nuclear war. Um, Once a war escalates that far, there's not a whole lot of time. Um, it's with all of the nuclear warheads that everybody in the world has right now, um, it's not like the Cold War fear that anyone's going to set that off right now, but it's still a possibility that something could happen and the entire planet could be destroyed because a couple people couldn't come to a compromise. So I'm really curious about what it was that triggered the war that decimated Hemera. Um, I think it would be really interesting to read sort of like a prequel that happened maybe 200 years earlier where it's talking about the build up to that war and what triggered it to actually go all out and why those governments or the governing factions couldn't come to an agreement. That would be fascinating to read. Um, but I really liked how it was also a look at how people can be taken advantage of if they blindly trust in their leadership. In this case, it happens to be military, and sometimes it's true in military, sometimes it's true in the police force, sometimes it's true in government, sometimes it's true in a company hierarchy, where your boss, like the person giving you orders, is making bad decisions or selfish decisions instead of decisions that are upholding the values of the organization as a whole. And sometimes you get stuck into and trapped into doing things you don't want to do or going places you don't want to go. And I thought that was really interesting how almost every single person um in the troop with Lane and Reese, they all had a reason why General Patton wanted to get rid of them. Like they were all standing in his way for him getting what he wanted, which is, unending wealth. So I'm also really curious as to what happens when General Patton gets to Hemera. Um, will he try and cover everything up again? Or will he actually start realizing his mistakes and change and become less selfish? Maybe I don't know. That would be really interesting to find out in a sequel. Um, and it was really cool how at the end Braden ends up being the one who turns on them. Like you're expecting the lieutenant to turn on them, but you're expecting it to be Ludger as well as the lieutenant. So when it's Braden instead, it's very unexpected, which was a cool little twist. Um, yeah. So I'm also really curious about what happens to Blaine. The whole book ends with him on his way out of Magna trying to get home, and he's the only survivor. He's the only person who could tell the real story of what actually happened. But we don't know if he makes it. So I'm curious, as either part of the same sequel as the general or maybe a different one, I don't know, could be what happens to Blaine, or it could even be a short story, like in between things. I don't know. It would be really interesting to see how, if when and how um the people left on Himeris start to actually rebuild and start to figure out a way of getting rid of the monsters that have been exposed to all the nuclear radiation and mutated beyond human recognition. Like they started out with human genes at some point, but there was so much mutation that they turned into monsters. And that's, I think, been one of the big fears of everyone, especially with nuclear power plants. After World War II, there's been a lot of fear that nuclear power plants don't have the appropriate safety to prevent that kind of genetic mutation from happening due to extreme radiation. Um, and there's a lot more safety that's been built into nuclear power plants. I have a lot of engineering friends who are very interested in alternative energy, and one of those is nuclear power. Um, so there's so much safety systems built in, but all it takes is one power plant to have a malfunction. Not even a massive disaster, but just a little malfunction, and everyone is terrified again. So I think that's really interesting to have something that explores what would happen in the worst possible case scenario for not just, a nuclear power plant falling apart, but a nuclear war as well, like I mentioned before. Um, so I think it would be really interesting to find out, do those warring factions ever come back together to form more stable governments? Or does it remain essentially lawless and everyone for themselves forever? In a way, they have rudimentary modern technology, but they're essentially living in the same type of world that people did before modern industry and modern political theory existed. So I'm curious what they would do to build their countries back, or to build new countries, or how they would go about educating each other and learning how to use the resources they have. I imagine there's probably a lot of good mineral deposits and things like that under the surface of the planet. So the planet might appear to be dead, but that doesn't mean it actually is. And there's probably a lot of resources there that the people who live there can't access yet because they don't have the equipment anymore, and they haven't figured out how to deal without that equipment yet. They're stuck, almost stuck taking the easy road. The easy road being, pillaging and stealing and fighting each other, instead of working together to try and build something that's beneficial to everyone. So I would be curious to see how Webb, um, and Willis and Blaine, if he survives, would work to improve the life of their settlement, and make it a more stable, more structured and sustainable place to live. I think that would be really interesting to learn more about. So I enjoyed it. It was a nice light read, fun, action paced. Okay, it's only fun if you like things that are action paced and like gory and stuff, but I had fun. So I had fun, and I'm not usually a gory person, so um yeah. Yeah, it definitely had a bit of a video game vibe to me, like Dylan had mentioned in the interview, and I thought that was really cool that he was inspired by video games, because I think that lends a certain feeling and emotion to the tone of the story. So there's a lot of, one thing happens and then another thing happens and then another thing happens, and there's never long drawn out periods of description where people are just waiting. So whenever there's a period of waiting, all he says is that Lane was tired of waiting, or that the waiting was making him nervous. But it's never more than maybe 5 words to say there was a long period of waiting, which I think worked really well for this particular story. So yeah, it was a fun read. Um, and I'm really curious about the before and after, but that's, I don't know. I always end up curious about the before and after of even my own stories. I end up with like prequels and sequels, and then I have to rearrange my that. I can't talk today. I've done too much talking. It's Memorial Day weekend, so I've been spending the time with family. Now I can't talk anymore. um but even with my own stories, I end up curious about what happened in the past and what's going to happen next, and I end up with stories that span multiple generations. And I start writing the story I had the idea for in the first place, and then I realize I should really publish them in order so readers can like start at the beginning of the story. Um anyway, so I tend to get very curious about the history and why things happened, and what if this, and what if Blaine dies? What then? If Blaine dies, then I suspect that his brother and his dad are going to be devastated. Not just devastated, but devastated in such a way that they don't really have any will to improve their community and make their settlement better. But if he does come back, then I think it would sort of breathe a breath of fresh life and a rejuvenation, I think, to that community, because he survived when nobody else did, which could inspire the entire community to thrive and not just survive. So I'm curious. Yeah. Well, I think that's my take on the Deadlands. I hope if you read it that you learned something useful from it, whether you loved it or you hated it or you thought it was interesting. Um, and I will be back in the beginning of June with our next interview. So if you want updates about when the live hangouts are scheduled, or if you want to know in advance what book we're reading, or get any behind the scenes information about anything that I'm working on, just go to amkc.com/join, and you'll get added to the group. We're having all sorts of cool stuff with my website is all fixed almost, and working, and there's membership forums and places where you can find maps and character sketches, and a list of all of the books we've read for the book club, and some of my favorite books that I've read before and outside of the book club. And so there's lots of cool stuff to find there. Um, amkc.com/join. So I look forward to seeing you again next month. So bye.